Hello and welcome to the Lunch Ladies podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Wagner, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing the 1986 sequel to the very, very well-known and amazing book Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card called Speaker for the Dead. And in today's episode, I'm going to be joined by my good friends, Moses Nix, Mason Townley, and last but not least, Evan Stauffer.
I thought this was a great sequel to the book Ender's Game. I loved Ender's Game, and this one, although slightly different in the direction it went, I think is wonderful.
My name is Mason Townley. I believe that this was a very solid book, and I agree with Evan that it was quite different in genre and in speech and in perspective, but I really enjoyed it.
I personally love reading Speaker for the Dead. I believe it is a great addition to the series. It definitely shows a lot of turning points in the story that lead up to the ending as a whole.
This song was gas.
Is that good?
I think that was good. I think that was good.
What a book!
What a book!
What a book!
Cinema.
Speaker for the Dead.
Speaker for the Dead.
Orson Scott Card.
What is
Ender's Game, Speaker for the Dead.
what a
Am I
what
right?
a
Like,
Masterpiece.
what a speaker? What is
What a speaker.
what a speaker? Am I right, guys?
What a speaker.
All right, but for real, to start it off, guys, how do we feel about Speaker for the Dead after Ender's Game? Like, what were our expectations going into this book, and what was it really like? You know, how do y'all feel about it?
My expectations were so high. Honestly, I loved Ender's Game. It was great.
Yeah.
But you know that Speaker for the Dead was actually the first book that Orson Scott Card was going to write.
For real?
Yeah. So
What?
he
What?
talked
That's
to
crazy.
his publishing company about writing a book. And Ender's Game was only a short story. They read that and they thought it was great. And he had this idea for Speaker for the Dead. But he was trying to write Ender into the part, but he couldn't get enough context with all the trauma that he went through. So he wrote Ender's Game to get all of the background, to see like how Ender got the egg and all of like why he's so wise.
That's pretty crazy.
That's cool.
So
That
he
is
didn't
crazy.
even like,
Yeah.
he just started with Speaker for the Dead, and he kind of just wrote the first one as like a filler.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
That's
think in
crazy
the
to think
in the
about.
introduction section of the book, he does say that like Speaker for the Dead was his original vision for like the series like going into it.
But
It's
he
really
made it work like really well, and especially like putting all the background story into the first book.
Yeah.
It really ties in perfectly into Speaker for the Dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you'd never guess that Ender's Game wasn't the first one that he imagined with the way he started that off.
Exactly.
It just
Yeah.
builds on to like how much of a complex character that Ender is. Like we can see him from a little boy to, well, he's 36 in the book now, but it's 3,000 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so going into it, what's y'all's interpretation of like the new setting and Speaker for the Dead? Like, what's y'all's interpretation of that?
Like my interpretation of like Lusitania, I definitely like pictured sort of it's a big planet, like kind of like a mountain village in a sense, like people living like deep in the mountains covered by trees, just very like well hidden in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my original interpretation was that it was like cathedral-like. They talk about their monasteries, their church is a really big part of it. So I figured they'd have these big buildings for that, and it would all center around that. But then later in the book, it kind of talks about how closer it is to the forest than I originally thought. So it kind of seemed like not as developed as the bugger species was in the first book, but also much more developed than the piggies were.
I was thinking of it like kind of like Endor from Star Wars.
Yeah.
Like it was like big trees in the forest, and like I had a mix of like the small trees that like are from
Yeah.
the piggy bodies when they planted the. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
But
a-
I was thinking like it was like a big village in the trees.
Yeah. I'm gonna take us off path a little bit and talk about kind of like the setting of the galaxy as a whole, because this is 3,000 years in the future. So I feel like the setting now has like completely changed. Because originally in Ender's Game, the setting, as we know, like it was on planet Earth, and it changed because it was a bit futuristic because they're in space and they have spaceships and they're fighting on different planets.
Yeah, but also Earth
But-
was the only known planet.
Yeah,
in
and
the
Earth
first
was
book.
the only human like inhabited planet.
Exactly.
But now we're 3,000 years in the future, And the main...
Isn't it 100 planets?
Yeah, well, that's like what the main governing force is called. It's called like the 100 galaxy, or
I
the
think it's
100
the 100
planet.
It's called the
yeah.
100
100
planets.
planets.
Yeah, the 100 planet order or something like that. But so yeah, it shows that there's at least 100 planets that are now inhabited by humans.
Right.
And another thing is that as you're talking about cathedrals in the churches, we see that 3,000 years in the future, the forces that really control the world now. It's stated in the book that the Ansible is power. So the current like governing force, which is the 100 planet coalition, whatever it's called. Sorry if we forgot that.
Yeah.
But then the reason that they're the head of the planets now is because they have control over the Ansible. The Ansible is, the communication factor, how they can talk to planet, like intergalactic travel instantaneously. And since they have power over that, they technically have power over trade, which is power over everything. Yeah. And then we also see the church has significant power. There's 2 churches now. There's the Vatican Church, which seems to be the most popular. It's the Catholic faith, but super far in the future. And they seem to have maybe a high control over the basic ways of life and religion of other people. And then there's also the other church. What was it called?
It's like the Church of Christ.
Yeah, the Church of the Word of Christ,
yeah.
which seems to be like a Mormon monastery, maybe a group that's a bit smaller than the Vatican.
And then there was also kind of a third group, which was the Speakers for the Dead, which was like all Ender inspired.
Yeah, right. Which is inspired by the original book they wrote for the Buggers. Which is now, but it's now changed. It's 3,000 years in the future. Yeah. So they're seen kind of like atheists. Like the churches don't really like them because they're truth seekers, and they question everything. And apparently, we see when the Pope, the Bishop of the planet that they're on, talks to him about how they have to swear an oath into not having a religion because he's surprised that Ender was actually baptized.
Yeah, he was just surprised that Ender was like, he saw both sides because, I mean, he at that point, he didn't know that he was really 3,000 years old.
Yeah.
I think, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, they have to remain, like, without a religion because there can't be any bias present. And without that bias, that's why a lot of people, especially people of the church and in those higher power, are almost afraid of these speakers because they are truth seekers and they cannot conform to the same things that the church's people do.
I think while we're on the topic of like having 100 planets, let's try to apply that to like our world, because if you really think about it, we were in the process of trying to find out if Mars is inhabitable, which as far as we know it kind of is. Just think like solid 20-30 years in the future. Do you think we could possibly make it fully inhabitable for humans to live on? I feel like just like we should think about that, just because like in the book, having 100 planets to live on that are actually inhabitable for humans is crazy to think. It's crazy to think of.
Insane.
We can't even begin to think that we could live on 100, comparing that to 100 in this world is just like kind of mind-boggling in a sense. So like, what's your opinion on that? Like, what are your thoughts?
I think it's crazy. Like, I think it shows, like, I think my main thing that I, like, really like about these books, especially Ender's Game, is I think it's very accurate in the depiction of the future. Because these books were made in the 1980s, and he literally had, like, futuristic Twitter in Ender's Game. Because they had, like, their profiles.
They had the Desmotees.
Yeah, right. Desmotees. So now in this...
Valentine.
And in this book, now, it's, like, the Ansible is, like, kind of like the internet. It's communication. They share files with each other.
There's AI Jane.
They have the AI Jane, which is a character that we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, an AI that's been developed because of the power of the Ansible. So it's pretty crazy.
It really makes you think like if like he was kind of like ahead of his time. Yeah. Just with the way he wrote the story.
Definitely.
Let this guy cook real quick.
So, short little summary of this book, Speaker for the Dead, is it follows Ender as he travels to a new planet as Speaker, and he represents the multiple people that died due to a conflict that is ongoing and a struggle that he has to slowly unravel. So during this book, a lot of mysteries are unfold, a lot of twists reveal themselves, and we'll be talking about those twists throughout this entire podcast.
Let's say
All right. So let's start talking about like the complexities of like the characters in the story.
Yeah, because there are a lot of complex characters.
So this
Pretty much every character is complex.
that was probably one of my favorite things about this book, to be completely honest, is
Yeah.
like we get to see the progression of so
so-
many different
yeah,
perspectives.
They
so
developed the
different.
character. He like Scott Orson Card, but he developed the characters really well throughout
Yeah.
the entire story.
To be fair, it was kind of hard to remember all of them because
all
of
the
how many
names,
there
it
were
was-
and how much they changed. But
All the names were. That's
So
probably
good.
the most difficult thing. There's so
And-
many times when I was reading chapters and I was like, "Wait, who's that again?" Like I'd read a
Yeah.
name and it's like the weirdest pronouncing because they're all like Portuguese and like
Mhm.
it's like such odd names that like I'd be forgetting like constantly throughout the book. Like
Right.
who
yeah,
is
I
who.
would have to take photos of like where it told me.
I'd
what
go back
character was who.
pages to like a
Well,
like
there
a
was
chapter with it all in
there was the
house.
family tree at the beginning.
Oh, I didn't see a family.
Wasn't
tree.
there the family
my
tree at
copy
the
didn't
beginning
have
of the
one.
book? Can you hand me the book?
Dang, you had a family tree.
Yeah. Well, keep talking.
But yeah. So wait, before we get into the complexities of the character, come on, segue. Can we talk about the different perspectives in this book? Do you all want to talk about like the different perspectives? Because like Ender's Game is very like one dimensional. Like follows.
I kept going to this.
Oh, I did
Family
not.
Tree.
I
That
didn't
would have
have
helped a
it.
lot.
Yeah.
Dang.
No, I
Family
didn't
tree in
have
my
it.
book.
Oh,
That's
that's
awesome.
But actually, real quick, calm little segue.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the different perspectives real quick. Like, because this book follows like dozens of different perspectives throughout
Yeah.
the entire novel.
It's absolutely third person omniscient.
Yeah.
I mean, it starts off on Lusitania, which is one of the developed human worlds. Lusitania is one of the worlds that houses the piggies, which they call them, or pequeños. And they're the only alien species that the human know of since the buggers were wiped out 3,000 years ago. So it's kind of like an important planet just because of that.
Yeah.
And it definitely starts out with that perspective from like the church that we mentioned and from the mayor of that town, all that.
Yeah.
We get. I think it's definitely third person omniscient. There's no limitations at all because I mean in the first chapter we jump right into what Pippo,
Yeah, people.
People.
whatever he was thinking when he first got was talking to Piggy's rooter, and when he first got Navinia, like we saw inside of his mind like all of his thoughts, and then we also saw in like what Navinia was thinking.
Yeah, that's what threw me off guard so like off rip is because I did not expect a different perspective like right off the bat of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I thought we're gonna be following Ender straight into this, but no, it gives us the first I think 3 chapters around that.
We
Or
didn't see
following
Ender. Ender
until,
came in
through
like
chapter 3, 4.
the end of chapter 2 actually, beginning
Oh.
of chapter 3.
Because it follows straight off, as you said, it follows People's perspective off rip.
Mm.
It opens to People's perspective, who was a xenologist at the beginning of the book, studying the piggies, like one of the first people to really analyze the piggies. Talking about the perspectives, I think that this is a good time to segue kind of into the first perspective that we see in the book, which we were talking about, which is Peepo. Yeah, definitely, caught some of us off guard, having a different perspective. I remember us talking about that right when we started reading the book. I remember Moses was like kind of disappointed because like he wanted like Ender off
Dude,
rip.
I loved it so much.
But then, so I remember we get straight into this, and I was pulling up a few quotes on my phone, which I'll talk about in a second. So, Peepo introduced early on, he's a very intelligent character, he's a xenologist, and he has a very unique compassion about him. And that's what you just fall instantly in love with this character. Because there's another character that we'll be talking about in a second, which is Navinia, who is a very tragic character, early on and later in the book. But Peepo is seemingly a solution to this very tragic, young child, and indoctrinates her into his life as basically an adopted child, which is something that Peepo did that everyone else struggled to in the colony. So Peepo was just a very interesting character, and his death was hard hidden. It was crazy, but what I want to write about, the reason I think he's extremely complex is simply because his effect on other characters. He's talked about for the rest of the novel, and he was only alive for about a chapter and a half. So, this is in a conversation that he's having with Navinia, as he's trying to convince her to kind of, understand him. Perhaps he didn't know it was an insult. He only smiled and said, faith, hope, and love, these 3. But the greatest of these is love. You don't know me, she said. Ah, he said, I am the judge of dreams, and you are the judge of love. Well, I find you guilty of dreaming good dreams, and sentence you to a lifetime of working and suffering for the sake of your dreams. I only hope that someday you won't declare me innocent of the crime of loving you. So, this is a conversation he's having with Navinia, and he's trying to convince her that he does care for her. He does understand the pain that she's going through, and it is harsh of her to say that he doesn't understand her pain and that he doesn't care for her.
And he was also one of the first people to actually care for her
Yeah.
since her parents' death.
Yeah.
The only, actually.
So, Peepo, he accepts these characters early on. We see that he's a very good, like a good father to Lebo, very genius scientist that everyone in the community respected. But when he dies, which we'll also talk about in a little bit, the impact that he leaves in his death is even more significant than when he was alive in the novel. So this is a quote, and it's Navina's reaction to Peepo's death. Now she felt the magnitude of Peepo's loss. The mutilated corpse on the hillside was not his death. It was merely his death's debris. Death itself was the empty place in her life. Peepo had been a rock in the storm, so solid and strong that she and Lebo sheltered together in his lee. Had not even known the storm existed, but now he was gone, and the storm had them, would carry them whatever way it would. So this shows that Peepo early on in the beginning of the book was so significant to Navinia and Lebo. He acted kind of as a shield of all the terrible, suffering of reality to them. He was a good father. He looked over them, and he truly did care for them. And he affects the rest of the characters and sets the tone for the rest of the novel of what a compassionate person should look like. So
it really just goes to show how well written this story is. Like you mentioned earlier, I was a little disappointed seeing a different point of view, but the fact that different point of view had me so encaptured, mm-hmm. and seeing him die so early on, it's just it definitely hits hard. So
yeah, 100%.
So another character, which is his son Lebo, he's complex because when we see him at the start of the story, he's a little mad. So there are rules set on what the humans can and cannot do with the alien race Pequeños. They can't talk about certain topics such as hierarchies and technology.
They can't show them anything basically.
Yeah.
That the humans have.
All they can do is see what they do and write that down. And this it frustrates Lebo throughout the whole time. But then after we see Peepo's death, Lebo's forced to step up and become the head xenologer of Lusitania. And he fell in love with it, and he also fell in love with Navinia.
Yeah.
And they ended up having 6 kids, I believe.
Which we'll definitely talk about in a little bit, because this was a huge, there's a huge affair situation that happened.
Between Navinia and Lebo.
I think it shows Lebo, because at the beginning he was kind of an apprentice to Peepo, but people saw him as lesser, he was a lesser of a prodigy than Navinia. Navinia actually got higher status. She passed the test quicker than Lebo did, but then it shows that the moment that Peepo died,
he had to fill in his father's footsteps.
He had to fill that in, and he had to lock in.
And he had to lock him in.
Yeah, so extremely interesting character. Lebo is definitely. Sadly, he did get cut off short, because when they do cut switch perspectives, which we'll also talk about, to Ender, and he's coming back as a speaker for Peepo's death. Navinia actually, after Peepo died, Navinia called for a speaker to come speak for his death, which is Ender gets the call.
Is Ender.
And then he comes in to do it. And then it cuts a time skip, because when he's traveling planets, there's a time skip. And we actually find out that during that time skip that Lebo also dies in the same cruel way that Peepo did.
Yeah, so I'd love to talk more about Navinia, actually, because I feel like it provides a lot of backstory for a lot of these characters.
Yeah, she's definitely, I feel like she's the main root of basically the entire, this entire book.
A lot of decisions and a lot of the characters all stem back to her in some way. So starting off, way at the very beginning, we realize that we talked about her parents' death. They die of something called the descolata, which is a disease. And it seems to it gets in the body and it breaks down everything. And that's how her parents died. Now her parents, as they were dying, as we said, were trying to find a cure for that disease, and that's why they kind of went out in greatness, as they did find a cure, but unfortunately they couldn't apply it to themselves. Anyways, Navinia then sees Peepo as that father figure, as he's teaching Navinia xenology, and she gets into xenology basically to just pick up the work that her parents left her. It was kind of like, it's not almost that like she enjoyed it, but it more felt like as a right in her job to do so, because she didn't have many people that she was connected with, and so she was kind of more connected to her work.
Yeah.
Peepo's son, is someone that Novena became super close to. They were kind of flirty with each other the whole time.
Oh yeah.
And it was before Peepo's death, like right before, Novena is looking at these files on their hologram computer, whatever it is, and Peepo comes in and he sees these files and he has a moment, like a eureka moment of like realization, and he's like, oh my god, like I have to go talk to the piggies right now. And so he runs out, and Novena still isn't sure of what he saw, like she doesn't know. But as Peepo goes out, he talks to the piggies. Novena tries to find Peepo, and when she does, she sees Peepo's body like dismembered and with a seed, like a tree seed in the middle of him. Okay, so he was, whatever he knew and whatever he saw in those files right before he died was clearly important to the pigs, so that it led the pigs to killing him. So Novena, being super close with Lebo, obviously in the future would have liked to marry him, but instead Novena wanted to conceal these files that people had seen, so that nobody else could see them and nobody else would go out.
And if they got
die.
married, then Lebo would have gotten access to her files.
Exactly.
As soon as they marry, it's like bank accounts. They all join together.
Yeah, they all shared, and she didn't want Lebo, who she loved so dearly, to see these things. So it was kind of like a double-edged blade. Like, she didn't want him to die, but she also was denied marriage to him. So Novena ended up marrying a guy named Marcal, and she did not love Marcal in any way. She
didn't like him at all.
No, she married him, in fact, to punish herself for allowing those files to be shown to people and like leading to his death. So
one thing though, real quick, one thing I actually like loved though is because Ender, as we know, was called to this planet to speak for multiple deaths. Yeah. Marcal was one of them, which is the person that Novena marries, and he's a cruel husband, which Mason's definitely going to talk about. But one thing it's actually hinted at the beginning of the novel, when we're actually following Peepo's and Novena's perspective in chapter 1, that she's gonna like marry, or Marcal, like their relationship is actually foreshadowed at the beginning, because we see that Marcal was the only person at the beginning of the book that she like stood up for. She was like, it's like one of the kids that was getting picked on, and she stood up for him at the beginning of the book. He got picked on because he was like bigger than all the other kids, and you don't know that this is gonna lead to anything, but then it does lead to their relationship, which Mason.
Because Marcal was like so obsessed
foreshadowing.
with Novena.
Yeah.
Foreshadowing. So Marcal was so obsessed with Novena after that moment that like ever since then,
Literary device.
Foreshadowing. But yeah, they ended up getting together. They had 5 children, or they housed 5 children, which we later find out it was actually an affair between.
Which was Evan was gonna say. That's the 5 kids that they had.
The affair between Novena and Lebo
while she was married to Marcal.
Yeah.
But Marcal couldn't sire children because he had a disease where fat was replacing all of his main organs and made him sterile. So he couldn't have kids in the first place.
Exactly. But nobody knew that until like the very end of the book. So
yeah.
Kind of a spoiler, but I guess that's what this is all about.
That's what it's all about.
So anyways, the 5 kids that Novena has, they're all like very studious and scientists in their own way, and in their upcoming, they're trying to also figure out what their mother was hiding from them, like what are these files, and in their studies she never allowed them to see that stuff, but they become very curious because of it. So some of them become xenologists, some of them study like species of plants specifically and not the piggies, but all of it kind of ties back to being more knowledgeable about the pequeñinos.
Yeah, and I think that like relationship with her children showed how complex she is, because her relationship is one of like struggle, and the one with Marcal, because she felt like, as you're saying, like she married him because she felt like she was like he would hit her, he'd come back, he'd get drunk, because he was always reminded of his failure, because he'd see all these kids that he knew were not his because he was not sterile. He knew these were not his kids, but it's a grave sin to have like adultery, so they never admitted it to anyone. Markel would come and beat his wife every day, which is Navinia, but she accepted it because she saw it as punishment for everything. For she felt like she was reliable for Pipo's death. Eventually, Lebo did die, so then
She also felt like she was.
So she felt like she was like responsible for all those deaths. Lebo does eventually die like a bit before Ender comes to the planet, because he was like he did something to help the Pekinos, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. But he dies in the same way, even though he was being looked after by Navinia to not display the truth that she was hiding from him at the beginning. So yeah, it shows how complex she is of a character throughout the story.
Well, wrapping up Navinia, let's get into Ender. Ender is the speaker for the dead, in a sense. Not in a sense, but he is the speaker for the dead. Obviously, he's the main character in the first book, but we are told in the end of that book, Ender's Game, that later, after he had killed all the buggers, he found an egg, the Formix queen egg. Formix is another word for buggers. So later on, we find out that Ender, not only being the speaker of the dead, traveling the planet, speaking for those who have deceased, he also travels to hopefully find a new planet to inhabit the queen and hopefully rebuild their whole society. He also struggles internally with all the guilt he has just from wiping out the entire race, and then he later on ends up basically alone because he leaves Valentine behind to go travel to the planet to speak for another deceased person.
Yeah, because Valentine, she gets familiar with this man on a planet called Trondheim, which is one of the planets that he had recently spoke, and Valentine and her man was going to get married, so that's why she stayed behind.
Yeah. And Ender also left just a few days before Valentine and her husband were about to have a kid.
Yeah.
He did leave right, I think about a week before the kid was born.
Which is crazy because now he wouldn't be able to see his nephew grow up, or nephew or niece grow up. So it's just one of the things. He also, we're not gonna talk about this, but like he had an AI named Jane, which eventually he ended up leaving her behind. So ultimately he ended up alone. And then actually we should I probably should talk about this first, but at the start, it is like shown that many people don't like Ender, but they don't know because most people don't like the Speaker of the Dead because they believe that he speaks nothing but devilish lies, which is actually like told by Bishop, who we also will talk about today. But Bishop is just like a leader of the church, and he's scared of Ender's power because Speaker of the Dead typically has power, government provided authority over churches.
So if we take a second, actually, at the beginning page of chapter 1, it says Ender the monster.
Yeah.
At the start, like, it's just I just want to know: do you guys think that Ender is a monster for wiping out all of the species?
I believe not, just
because like he still has the egg and stuff too.
Ultimately, Ender never changed at heart. He's still the same person he was from the first book, but he was tricked, like ultimately tricked, and he was tricked. He saved the world, but like at what cost?
He wasn't actually aware that he destroyed the bugger race. He was only taught or led to do that by the Star Wars Congress. So I don't think he was a monster.
I mean, and the fact that he kept that queen's egg at the end and has been trying to find a home for them just shows like Ender's a compassionate character. Yeah. I think people don't see him for a person. They only see him as the monster killer.
Yeah. And I kind of like the way that the author allows these characters 3,000 years later to interpret Ender. I think it's kind of like showing how history, even in the real world, can get lost after such a time, and new interpretations of an event can come up.
Because as soon as Civil War was over, we saw that on Earth there was a split and divide of people. Like Ender couldn't return home because there were people that hated him and they wanted him dead. But then again, there were also a massive group of people that were like praising him because he stopped this quote unquote war.
Yeah. But then also, like, him coming to this planet, this new planet, to speak for the deaths of Peepo, Lebo, and Markow. While he's there, you know, he sees both the piggies being on this planet, a new species. He sees it as a way to make up for, you know, the sins that he grieves over. You know, he does have trauma for killing, you know, being known as a xenocide, for, you know, killing all of, like, almost the entire species of, you know, buggers. So now he's trying to make up for it, and he sees the Pekinos being on this planet as a way that he can truly make up for it.
And that part just really helps him like gain the trust of others, especially Bishop Peregrino. So because Bishop sees him as like a much more compassionate person, and seeing that, he's able to just trust him more and more. And so,
But yeah. So I think that this is a good segue into what we were going to talk about, which is the Pekinos. So, like, these are the aliens.
These
and
are
the
weird things.
Yeah.
Oh my God, they're so weird.
They're like little. They're like these weird, like, pig aliens.
They
that are
say
intelligent.
pig, but like in my mind, I don't picture a pig. I think of like just a round ball. Of,
So
like,
there
meat
there
with a
are
belly button.
comics.
there
No, yeah, they
there
look like
is a
pigs. I
comic.
saw
There are
comic.
comics.
Yeah, they
Yes,
look like just straight up
and
pigs.
They literally look like a dog pig.
They're just
Get
pigs.
outta
I'll
here.
come
Yeah.
show this
No,
up
that's
to
how
the
I s-
camera.
What?
But it's like a dog pig crossover.
that's kind of
So basically,
that's not.
And they have wet
interpreted.
bellies.
yeah, they have wet bellies.
They have wet bellies.
All right, so
apparently.
basically these
Whatever that
Pekinos,
means.
we know nothing about it. Ender comes in here and he knows nothing. Like, and like a lot of the characters don't know anything about them. People, you know, they're these like the scientists are trying to figure out what they are, but they never truly like understand them. At least Peepo doesn't until the end of the novel, when Ender meets up with the Pekinos and, you know, he starts talking to them and he tries to, you know, get the societies together. Like, he tries to mix humans, Pekinos, and buggers. Only then, at the end of the novel, does he truly find out like how they work, like what they're thinking. But the whole like middle section of the novel, like the beginning to like late middle, it's constant questioning like what are they really thinking, what are their intentions.
Yeah, and you can imagine how hard that is to find out. It would take like years and years to get the smallest bits of information, because remember, they can't ask questions that give any kind of inference to a human life. Like, they can't reference anything that has to do with like metal tools or like ships or intergalactic travel, communication, technology,
Any
anything.
form of
No
technology.
form of
Yeah.
technology they can't ask
Like,
about.
even their own lives, they're not allowed to speak of. Even when they walk up to these people, they are trained to have a perfectly straight face, like a
Yeah.
poker face the whole time, so that they don't even reveal human emotion to these piggies.
So the thing we learn about the piggies is that it is a matriarchy, and so the woman piggies do kind of run their whole society, and
And they call them the mothers. Yeah.
the mothers.
And those are unfertile women.
Yeah.
Because the females actually die very early on. They die during childbirth. But the unfertile ones are the ones that live to become basically, you know, the matriarchs
Mhm.
of the young male, which is basically a majority of the living species of Pekinos.
And that's the Pekinos that go and they get food and
They meet up with the humans and they speak to them. But then, like what we were talking about with Lebo and Peepo dying, they died in an act of like their guts being cut open, their organs out, and they died like experiencing all of it. They felt all of it. And like early on, you see this as like, oh, these piggies, this Pekinos, they're cruel. Like, what are their intentions? But
So
later on, we find out that
it's actually a symbol of honor. So it's the Pekinos take this herb, and so it numbs their whole body, and they are cut open, their organs are spread out, and a tree is planted in them, and that is a symbol for rebirth. And the tree would grow out, and it resembles as like an honor of what they've done in their past. So they saw Peepo and Lebo as something great, and they thought that this is a good way of honoring them.
Yeah, and the tree to them symbolizes their third life, is what they call it. So their first life is like when they're still being
babies.
born, right? And then they come out and they live.
and they
what
come
they
out
call,
of a
like,
tree.
The shade, right? Like kind of sunny. but
And then
kinda
that's their
shady,
second
whatever.
life, which
That's
is
their second life, yeah. Like what we know as
like
a
we
life.
walk around and talk to each other and
Yeah,
stuff.
and then their third life when they're like slaughtered, I guess, to a human like
It's
this.
a tree.
they turn into
They
a
turn
tree.
into a tree, which they can still communicate with because it's like in their
But
ancestry, I
only
guess.
certain members of that species can communicate with them.
Right, they have to do a ritual.
They have to
and
do rituals and speak a specific
sing.
language
It's
Yeah.
tree speak. is
Tree
what they have
speak.
to do.
to speak to the ancestors that have become trees.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting. So when they killed Lebo and Peepo, they thought that they'd also turn into trees because they'd never, they don't understand like dark. So they did that out of honor.
I feel like it's a great way to show the complexity of these characters, because that's probably one of the biggest plot twists. Because as far as we knew at the beginning of the book, they were just they just killed them for no reason due to finding files that were probably suspicious. That I know when I interpreted it, I was like, oh, there must have been something on those files that either they were hiding or like that,
it offended them.
it offended them, so it led them to
Yeah.
lash out and kill. So learning later on that they were doing it as a symbol of honor, and they just didn't, in a sense didn't know any better. It's just a crazy thing to think about, because I mean, in a way, it's kind of how we are in a sense. Like growing up, some things we do, we don't know any better, or we're trained.
Yeah.
So to get into the themes of the story, I think the main theme of this is definitely cultural difference and respect, because we see the Pequeños as almost an opposite of the humans in some ways.
Right. So basically, like the Pequeños, like they can't reveal anything about their lives or or ask about anybody else's personal lives. They're just trained to only do what they're supposed to do. Humans, like they can't even ask about like all these humans, like technological advancements, so they can't even like learn about new things themselves. And so like I feel like that plays a big part, and plays a big part in their mysteriousness in a sense, because we don't know much about them.
And we see the humans when they first talk to the piggies, they have no idea what they're like. They see these rituals with the trees, and they find this very, very off-putting and weird, but they do realize that it is part of their culture and they have to respect it. They also have to think about the matriarchy that they are in, and when Lebo and Peepo talk about, oh, we have a male, it's not a male-run society, it's an even society, and that's when the Pequeños go back and they talk to the mothers and something happens, and it's all about respect within them.
Yeah, it's also like another thing, like when they started killing, if like we are like given the view that they're just mindless killers, like they don't think, they just kind of killed, or if they're offended or they revealed something that shouldn't have been revealed, they kill. So that kind of like brings a state of fear, which can kind of relate to like real life references, being fearful of someone due to cultural differences.
Yeah, and that's because the humans don't understand their
Exactly.
culture fully yet. And we also see like with the piggies, whenever they learn something, like, or something slips out because Peepo or Lebo or Navina said something about human culture, the piggies are always like extremely shocked. So, like when they learn that humans, both men and women, stood equal ground in laws and rulemaking, they freaked out. They were like, "You let like men speak and make laws or whatever." Like they were just shook.
Yeah. They all I think it was describing them as like physically taken back, and they were all just like they were hiding in a way from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So definitely like cultural understanding, like because without originally understanding each other, they just like off rip, they just start confronting each other as if like it's out of hate. So like when they killed Lebo and Peepo, there was no understanding because they never communicated that understanding, because they were fearful of finding the truth, and like if they asked the Pequeños why they did this, that maybe they'll die too. So they thought this cultural difference was just unobtainable, something that they can't cross. They thought it was out of hate.
They also probably couldn't even talk about it, or why they did it in the first place, which just creates an even bigger shift. So even if they did ask them and they just respond with "oh no" or something in a sense, I just like, I feel like if they did try to ask at first, I feel like that would have created like a much larger gap between like actually becoming together as unity, just because they are not allowed to speak on their personal life. So having like an outlier source coming in to investigate and actually find out the truth, like Ender, it really helps them bond together, because otherwise I think without his help it wouldn't have gone too well, and it was just like it would have essentially just divided people for who knows how long.
Yeah, and we see that at the end of the story the reason that they come together, the Pekinos, the buggers, and the humans, is because of mutual understanding. They finally sit down, they conversate with no barriers. They have translators for language barriers. They just sit down and they try to understand each other. They hear each other's culture out. They don't fight it out. They don't duke it out. They sit down. Ender talks to the Pekinos, and they already talked with the buggers beforehand, the hive queen, and they all just get past their cultural differences and truly sit there and try to understand each other.
Ender says that he needs to understand the piggies, which is something so feared by the humans, but Ender is like, no, we have to learn these people, because if we're gonna live with these people and if we're gonna rebel with these people, then we have to know them fully.
You can really apply that to a lot of real life examples, like not just like historically and up till now, like especially like 4 years back during quarantine, just the whole race dilemma, like, and not even just race, just be culturally in general, like there's always someone who's like culturally insensitive who doesn't know it, or it's ignorant in a sense. So I feel like that like really shows us that it's important to always like be open-minded to just everybody and everybody's culture.
And you gotta think when this book was also written. It was written in 1986. So that was around the time when the USA and the Soviet Union were having some disputes, and I think this was just a kind of thing to say, just sit down, talk to each other. It can be applied to everything. You have a dispute with somebody, with your neighbor, just sit down and talk. It's all about understanding. I think that's just the big story
100%.
that Orson Scott Card just tried to paint for us.
Yeah. So there's multiple symbols in this book, and I think one of the first ones is this.
The fence.
So basically, on the planet, what's the planet?
Lusitania.
Sorry, it's just a weird name. So on the planet Lusitania, where the Pekinos live, there's actually this huge fence that surrounds the town that the humans live in, and that divides them from the Pekinos' forest that they live in. This fence represents just the divide between them and Pekinos. Cultural divide between them and Pekinos. They quite literally fence themselves out of Pekino society to keep themselves almost isolated from the rest of the world. So yeah, it definitely shows the isolation and the cultural differences.
Another symbol we've got is the trees.
Oh yeah.
Out of
the piggies. The piggies.
And I think that this symbol just resembles honor in renewal in new life, because this is their way of saying like this guy did great things,
right?
And the tree represents new ideas and new life brought on by that piggy.
Yeah,
it's their send off to the third life, like what we were talking about. Like they don't see what we believe is like human life or their second life to be the end, and I guess in the church as well, like they talked about how human life wasn't the end as well. You know, you go off to heaven, but their version of heaven is this third life.
I feel like you could also argue that like the tree really means like unity, because like as you find out that they're able to speak to the trees like tree speak, so they're by like honoring them, they are like they think they'll be able to speak to them after the tree is grown.
Yeah. So
that like that's them trying to like honor them and like still keep them alive in a sense, that but we don't know is like the humans don't understand that.
Yeah. So yeah, that was episode 1 of the Lunch Ladies podcast.
Hooray.
Oh yeah! Yay!
Hip hip
Hooray! You know, I think it was pretty successful. I think it was pretty good, pretty fun stuff.
Maybe it's fun.
Podcast. Yeah,
very fun. Just a little more organized next time. But
yeah, run it back.
But overall, enjoyable book, bro. Orson Scott Card cooked. He cooked.
Yeah,
I will be reading about Bean. We'll be reading about Bean.
But yeah.
Facts.
Oh yeah.
I remember Bean.
But yeah, thank you for listening to this amazing podcast. And until next time, we're out of here.